One of these days we should do it where one of us sitting on the leg extension and one of us on the leg. All right.
Dude, I'm game.
Okay, sweet. All right. Welcome back to the Wednesday Word Wad. I am here with Mike, and we are going to be going over the most scientific way to mass, to bulk, to gain weight.
Yes.
Yes.
To get huge.
Yes. So I think this is very specific to Mike right now. He is a couple months off of a bodybuilding show where he got his pro card.
Yep.
Officially a pro. Got the drug test back too. He is clean. All you haters. So, Mike, you are kind of entering into this next phase, preparing for your first pro show in about a year, correct?
Yeah, probably about a year. Maybe
Okay.
15 months from now I'll compete.
All right. You want to tell us a little bit about how you're kind of approaching this next mass phase?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note there's probably the most scientific way, which would be the way where you're putting on the most amount of lean tissue in an efficient amount of time with the least amount of fat tissue possible. So if you mass uber aggressively, oftentimes what happens is you can gain a lot of fat tissue, and even though you could gain a lot of lean tissue during that time, then you're going to spending a lot of time in the future cutting to get rid of that fat tissue that you acquired.
Yes.
So there are P ratios, there are efficient ways to do it. There's also reality as well, and I think it's important to note that, because for me, every time I have a plan, I have an idea of the rate I want to do it, but I always blow by it. No, you're good.
Go for it.
Yeah. So anyhow, this last show, I competed on stage. I had, according to ADEXA, about a week prior, I had, I believe, 197 pounds of fat-free mass, which was pretty cool because I entered into show prep at 193 pounds of fat-free mass. So the last show, I lost over 35 pounds, but I also gained 4 pounds of lean tissue during that 10 to 12 week series into the show. So what that taught me was I'm pretty good at holding on to my lean tissue and cutting. Maybe I do things a little bit better with my protein. Maybe I train a little bit more intelligently. It could also be how I kind of schematically put together my entire macro cycle. But this last time, I decided to mass a little bit more aggressively. So I just did a DEXA today, 60 days after that previous DEXA. I weighed in at 243.1 pounds on the DEXA, but I had just under 209 pounds of fat-free mass. So I went from like 7-ish% body fat, 6 or 7%, up to 14.9. But I gained 11 pounds of fat-free mass in 60 days, which that's kind of not usual.
Yeah.
So I point that out to say I would not mass as aggressively as I'm doing it for myself, but there are going to be individual case-by-case circumstances where maybe someone could gain at a quicker rate.
Yeah. I definitely think that I've done both. I've done kind of the just obnoxious seafood diet. You see it and you eat it, and you gain a substantial amount of body fat pretty quick.
Yep.
I remember the first time doing a mass phase and like figuring out, you actually like to gain weight, you have to increase the caloric intake. I knew that was what you had to do, but I didn't know what it looked like. So I eventually figured it out. Like I was literally doing everything. I remember I was still playing baseball in college, and for breakfast I would put like 3 or 4 servings of olive oil in a fruit smoothie.
Nice.
Because it was just and you had to drink it in a certain amount of time because otherwise it would just like separate from the water and everything else. So it was pretty gross if you didn't eat it fast enough.
Have you seen the recent research on olive oil?
Did Menno post it?
He just posted it, and what they found was when people had equal amount of calories, equal deficit, but majority of their fat from olive oil versus saturated fat, the olive oil group actually lost a lot more body fat.
And
so you might have been onto something.
So how is that possible? I haven't. I just saw the headline. I didn't look into it. What was the?
Yeah, so he tried to describe in the caption a bit, and then you could kind of read through the study. Olive oil might have had some positive effects on inflammatory markers. Now, people try to speculate and say that the olive oil, that type of fatty acid composition, is going to have a better hormonal effect, so maybe higher test. But the effect would be so trivial based on what we've seen in other literature that I wouldn't like speculate or extrapolate that type of reasoning for why the olive oil group lost more.
Okay.
So to be honest, I'm not really quite sure.
Yeah. More research needs to be done.
Yeah, I mean, we could look at like the adherence overall. Maybe the olive oil group, olive oil didn't taste as good, so maybe they were more adherent to their calories, but it was like very well controlled, the study. So I'm not quite sure.
Cool. Well, important to note and keep in mind. But kind of going back, I remember the first time I did it, I went from about 170 pounds. That was like the heaviest I had been at the time. I was a freshman or sophomore in college, and then I got up to 188, and I thought I was huge.
Yeah.
And it's funny because 188 is still less than what Mike weighs on stage at like 6% body fat. So it's all, I guess, the perspective. Which in 188 compared to 170 is a substantial amount of weight difference. So first time doing that, and then it gained a substantial amount of muscle, and then kind of leaned out back down to like 170, 175. But then the next year, I was so excited to, after losing the weight and being around that 170, 175, I was so excited to eat like more processed foods, I guess the fun foods, and eat more again. Like I had such horrible diet fatigue, and just like, because at the beginning, like it was just the basics, like horrible chicken, rice, and boring. Like still learning about the better options and how to go about it. In 3 weeks, I went from 173 to about 188 again. And I just like ate everything in sight. So then I had to go on like a little maintenance phase, and then I did a little mini cut and kind of leveled everything off. A lot of the bloating went away, and then I was back to normal. So, but I think that it is. Would you say it's pretty normal for people within this space to kind of go through the fluctuations as they learn how to do things, and go through an intelligent mass phase, and then kind of lean out for the summer? Or do you think that it's more typical for people to kind of main gain or maintain gain? How would you?
Yeah.
What would you say about that?
So I think if you want to put on as much lean tissue as possible, being around calorie maintenance or in a surplus is going to be the most advantageous way to do it.
Yes.
Like I mentioned before, like I've cut for shows and have actually gained lean tissue along the way. So that is doable, and that's one of the reasons why I'm more willing to gain a little bit more aggressively in a mass phase, because I know even when I go to the cut, like it's not going to screw me over, and I can cut relatively aggressively and be fine. Yeah. But yeah, I definitely recommend being in a pure surplus. I recommend not being in too grand of a surplus. So don't do what I'm doing. There was a cool study that was published relatively recently where a group of people were in an 800 calorie surplus versus a 300 calorie surplus. At the end of 12 weeks, I believe it was, both groups added the same amount of lean tissue, but the 800 calorie daily surplus group added a lot more fat tissue. So then down the road, they'd have to probably spend more time in a deficit taking off that fat, which would not be a period where they're going to be best suited for building muscle. So the surplus doesn't have to be huge, but it has to be consistent. Oftentimes what happens, I think, in this industry is people do an aggressive cut, they get to where they want, and then all of a sudden they go crazy on food.
Like I did.
And yeah, like you did, and they only are able to be in a gain phase for like 6 to 8 weeks, which really isn't that much time. And then all of a sudden they feel like they got too fat, and they're like, crap, it's time to cut again. Yeah. So if you gain too aggressively, that's going to decrease the duration of which you're going to be in a more anabolic environment for building muscle. And if there's only so much lean tissue that you can put on a weekly basis without the majority of the excess being fat tissue after that, it doesn't necessarily make much sense to gain at a quick rate. Now with this last mass for me, I've kind of defied the odds a little bit. So we'll take it, but I wouldn't like replicate what I'm doing. Yeah. This is a little bit unique. So yeah, 300 calorie surplus, run it for a while. Typically most males mass best between 10 and 20% body fat. So if you do a show of some sort, it's generally recommended to put some fat on like immediately. Yeah. And then from there, mass until you get to an uncomfortable, I think Israel, he calls it an uncomfortable aesthetic, where you're no longer liking the way you look. Yeah. and everyone's going to have a differing value towards like how fat they're willing to get. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you're comfortable at 25% body fat and you want to keep massing until you're 25, and you're healthy and your labs are great, and your doctor says you're not going to die next month, yeah, go for it.
So would you say that general kind of rule of thumb is you can use the mirror as your greatest tool to measure, like with your if you need to put on some, if you want to gain some weight, put on some weight, you kind of look in the mirror, all right, I'm going to go until I don't like the way that I look. And then is it the same for losing weight? I know last week we discussed that like we should probably keep the weight loss to about 10% of your overall body weight.
Yeah.
Is that the same for massing?
I mean, it depends. I guess like with massing, I've put on since the show 13%, 14% body weight. But I'm still at a body fat percentage according to DEXA where like I want to keep gaining. Like I'm a little too comfortable right now.
Yeah, you're not even like near that like average like ideal like health. You're still kind of below that.
Yeah, I'm still kind of below, and I'm heavy. So it kind of depends. With massing, I think it's beneficial to mass for longer periods of time. So like with cutting, like we talked about, kind of keeping it 10 weeks or shorter. Massing, I would recommend at least minimum 12 weeks in a surplus. So definitely elongate it some. Typically the rate's going to be slower. And then what you can do is you could do periods of maintenance, separating massing periods where you resensitize yourself to training volume, or you could even do like little 2 to 6 week mini cuts along the way to resensitize your body to muscle building. But spending most of your career in a surplus, as long as you're healthy and comfortable, is probably the best way to have the most lean tissue possible in the long run.
Awesome.
It's like if you want to have the most money, you're going to want to be in a dollar surplus where you're reinvesting these dollars over and over and over again. If you're going out on vacation and spending tons of money, 10 years from now, you're not going to have as much money than if you didn't do it. But of course, like cutting, going on vacation, those are fun periods of time where you might want to like kind of enjoy the fruits of your labor. And that makes sense too. I will say with massing, if you get to a point where you've gained so much weight that your cardio is disrupting your ability to train close to failure, like you do a set of like 10 reps on bicep curls on the cable machine, and all of a sudden you're like huffing and puffing and you're breathing and you're like, feel like you're suffocating, right? It's taking you minutes to recover. You probably need to chill and maybe not keep massing. So if your aerobic capacity, aerobic function is limiting your ability to take the musculature to near failure on a mechanical level, then you might have gotten too big. And if your training's not effective, then you're not going to build as much muscle.
I would say that that's the same kind of rule of thumb if like everyday activities, walking up and down your flight of stairs, if you're having trouble sleep, if your labs are looking a little funky too. Probably. I know when I mass, I know I don't gain a substantial amount of weight or body fat, but I do keep track of like blood pressure and stuff like that. And then also like resting heart rate, I can tell a difference when I'm sleeping and I'm at a lower body fat percentage, a lower body weight. My heart rate, my resting heart rate at night is in the like mid to high 40s, and then when I'm 30 pounds heavier, it's like mid to low 50s. So there's like an 8 beat per minute difference on average. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something to monitor.
Yeah, mine fluctuates a bit more than that.
Are you like 10, 15?
Like 20.
Really? That's crazy.
When I'm show lean, I'll get down into like the 30s resting heart rate. And then when like I've been like high 60s, peak mass, big boy. So that is something to monitor. I will say this too. The more muscle you get, the more advanced you get, probably the lower you're going to want to cap your max body fat percentage off at, just because you have so much more tissue that's going to be kind of cumbersome for living life with. So like for me, when I was younger, I would cap my body fat percentage high threshold off at maybe 25%. If I did that now, I'd be like over 300 pounds. So I'm probably going to now in the future cap it at like 17, 18%. So I'm not going to mass that much further.
Cool.
But where you are in your training kind of like journey, that's going to affect it.
Yeah.
Like you don't see IFBB bodybuilders walking around at 22% body fat.
No.
The reason is they have so much muscle that that'd be so cumbersome that they would just like die. They would not feel very good.
Yeah, they wouldn't be able to move.
Yeah.
I think a lot of other factors come into play with that as well. So
Yeah, no, there's other variables to consider.
Other variables. Mike, do you have any kind of closing statements, like a key takeaway with, I know we kind of talked about a lot, we're talking pretty fast,
Yeah.
so any key takeaways that people can take home right away?
Yeah, key takeaways are be willing to put on some fat tissue.
Yeah,
That's
huge.
the price of putting on more muscle. Don't worry about doing it all at once. We live in a society where we want all the huge muscles at once. We want to be shredded at once. If you go into that yo-yo way of thinking, you're probably going to get nowhere. So create a goal, challenge yourself to buckle up and stick with it for a long duration of time.
Like years.
Being consistent with it. If you look in the natural bodybuilding realm, the guys that make the most progress are the ones that compete like once every 2 years. And I've seen lots of competitors who have said they competed every year, and once they took a break, that's actually when they progressed within the sport and they wish they did it earlier. And the break essentially was training hard, eating in a surplus, being consistent with it over time.
Yeah.
And have fun with it.
Yeah. Enjoy the food.
Enjoy it, yeah, and dirty bulking is not recommended.
No.
You don't have to be in a huge surplus
Nope.
to gain a lot of lean tissue.
No. Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Sweet.